If you're watching this review because you're undecided on whether or not to buy Maiden Spell, I have some good news for you and some bad news. The good news is, if you're thinking about getting it for single player, I can tell you all about that, and what I'm going to tell you is all good. The bad news is, if you're thinking about getting this for its online play, I can't tell you anything because it's locked behind the Nintendo Switch Online subscription, which I used to have, despite thinking it's a bit of a cheap scam, and I may get it again one day, but I don't currently have it, and I'm not going to resubscribe just for one game. Sorry. Now, my understanding is that locking the online like this is not a developer or publisher choice, but is a requirement from Nintendo, which is a real shame. But I do hope those of you who are playing online can find matches easily enough, and please do comment on your experiences below to give others an idea of what it's like. With that said, let's look at the game itself, because even though online play is an important part of this title, there is a very sizable amount of single player content to get your teeth sunk into too. So Maiden Spell is an example of what I've seen called a ballet shmup, with there being no stages, no scrolling, no popcorn enemies, nothing in fact except boss fights against, in this case, cute little stylized monster girls who look like they've walked straight out the advertising for a creperie in Harajuku or Daikanyama. There are 8 of these characters, and each has their own very unique moveset, more akin to the differences found between characters in a fighting game than a regular shmup. And that is because, in many ways, this is a kind of fighting game shmup hybrid, with each stage being a battle of 2 to 5 rounds, during which you face off against a single opponent and try to figure out their patterns and weaknesses, while dodging, blocking and landing blows of your own. To do this, you have 4 different moves at your disposal. One is something like a standard shot, which can be fired repeatedly and targets your opponent automatically as you dance around each other. Secondly, you have a non-targeted shot that, if your opponent doesn't move, will never hit them. What's the point of a shot like that, you may well ask? Well, the point is that this shot usually spreads out slowly, so when you force your opponent to move with your targeted shot, they now have a tricky minefield to dodge their way through. Your third option is another offensive move, and this really does vary massively character to character. It's usually more powerful or more elaborate than either standard shot, but while you can use it fairly often, it does have a cooldown between uses, preventing you from just spamming it repeatedly for an easy win. Lastly, you have a defensive move which will allow you to briefly become invincible or clear a circle in enemy bullets, and can be used to escape any tight corners you find yourself in. This also has a cooldown timer, one that takes a fair while to refill and won't save you if you don't use it in tandem with your own skill to find yourself a better position. There is also a movement slowdown button you can use at any time for when you require a bit of finesse in your dodging. A lot of these moves are very unusual and imaginative, and it all adds up to a fair amount to think about and strategize over during fights, not least when you consider your opponent has the same range of options open to themselves too. There is a tutorial, but with some of the moves, particularly the defensive ones, it's not always immediately obvious quite what it does. Add to this the fact that, as mentioned, the specifics of each character's moves are very, very different, and you'll really need a long time to experiment with everyone to either find which character best suits you, or just purely for the fun of seeing all the unique moves on offer. The main place you'll be doing this is in the game's story mode, which sees you descending beneath the ground on a quest to retrieve a magic red jewel. Each character faces different opponents in a different order, and each story is different too, although all centre on the same adventure to find the magic jewel. These stories are told through short, snappy dialogues that occur before each face-off, and they can be skipped if you want to get straight to the action, but personally I found them a lot more amusing than the usual shmup fare, and each maiden has their own personality which is well brought to life in these snippets of conversation. After the talking is done, it's straight into battle, with things unfolding in a quite unique way. You have cards which act as lives, and whoever loses all their cards first loses the battle. However, you can take several hits before you lose a card, making each card a kind of single round within a larger fight. On top of that, every time your opponent drops down to their last hit, they activate something called Magnus, which both gives them special attacks and provides them with a defensive barrier that requires chipping away at to deplete, rather than the one-strike kills of the earlier rounds. Of course, these all get more and more difficult the deeper in the fight you are. It all means each fight progresses very differently, and it will take a long time before you can confidently predict patterns and sequences of attacks, which prevents the game from ever feeling stale. At the start of the game, You only have 2 characters available, but you unlock more the more you play. You also unlock a couple of extra chapters, and completely playing through the story mode, even just on normal, is going to provide a good solid few hours of fun. There are 4 difficulty modes, and for the most part normal is a fair bit easier than normal in most shmups. The extra chapters, however, do ramp things up, the final one in particular, and while the game generally does an absolutely excellent job of signalling incoming attacks and delineating patterns from each other, there were a couple of times towards the end where I did find I was dying, not because I couldn't dodge enemy shots, but because I just wasn't entirely clear quite what was happening. There are also times when you get hit with status effects, and again, there were times when I just wasn't quite sure what was happening to me. This is only at the very end of the game though, and the majority of the time the game, very impressively given the chaos, manages to keep everything clear and easy to read. Other than the story mode, you can also play local versus battles against either another player or against CPU opponents, and there are also a couple of training options. There's also a mode for taking on opponents starting from their Magnus form, and there's further added replayability in going for both high scores and faster times, with times being recorded not just for each battle, but for each section of each battle. In other words, even without online play, you're not going to get bored with this one. Further little extras are a music room and a gallery, each with a host of songs or images, many of which require unlocking through play, and you're going to want to unlock as much as you can because the artwork for this game is fantastic. The music isn't something I'm personally likely to listen to outside the game, but it is lush and beautiful and perfectly suited to the whimsical nature of the game. There's also a really impressive amount of customization and options available, especially in terms of changing aspects of the display, and the options should allow you to tailor every aspect of the game exactly how you want it. One tiny minus point here, however, is there are a few seconds of loading moving between many of the menus, but it's not really anything bothersome. And on the topic of options, this may seem an odd thing to praise in a shmup review, but the menus, UI, and just general look of the meta elements of the game are some of the most impressive I've ever seen. Everything is both simple and clean while also being stylish and intuitive. There's a lot of attention to detail here and so many little touches that make this feel like it really had a lot of thought and effort put into every aspect of its design. Things like the 2 maidens dancing in the music room, for example, perfectly sum this up. It's just a little animation of literally 2 frames, but it's things like this that give the whole game and its presentation an air of extra charm and create a thoroughly polished impression. So all in all, even without the online component, this game is well worth trying. It's something a bit different, it's full of charm and fantasy and unique designs, and there's more than enough content to keep even a single player happy for a very long time indeed. I'd give Maiden Spell an 8.5 out of 10, and if I ever do resubscribe to Nintendo's online, it'll be this as much as Smash or Mario Kart I'll be most excited about playing. So just a reminder, please really do comment if you have experienced the online portion. I'm sure the battles will be great, but it would be good to hear people's first-hand experiences regarding finding matches, etc. Thanks in advance to anyone who does so, and thanks as ever for watching. See you next time. Cheers.